Do you know what it means to believe so fiercely that you forget what it was you believed in? The voice is quiet, a whisper carried through the static of 1,000 dead Vox channels. It seeps through the dust of centuries, through the bones of a world that forgot its own name long ago. They call it Eidolica Primus, though even that title is a relic, a word preserved by administratum clerks who have never seen its sunless skies. To the Imperium, it is a shrine world, pure, unyielding, and utterly devoted. But to those few who have stood upon its ashen soil, it is something else entirely, a nightmare carved from faith. When the pilgrim ships first approach its orbit, the light of the system's dying star glints off a planetary crust blanketed in white. Not snow, but ash. It drifts endlessly across the ruins of cathedrals the size of continents. Statues of saints rise like mountains, their faces long since eroded by time, yet still gazing upward as if in eternal supplication. The air itself seems to hum with prayer, low, constant, like the vibration of a dying machine. On Eidolica Primus, there are no cities. There are only sanctuaries, billions of them, each built upon the ruins of another, each dedicated to a different aspect of the Emperor's light. The people do not live here so much as serve here. Every breath, every thought, every movement is an act of worship. From birth, they are taught that to question is heresy, and to dream is treason. Children are baptized in oil, their first cries drowned beneath the chants of the ecclesiarchy. They are raised in the shadows of spires so vast they blot out the sun, learning to carve purity seals before they can write their own names. By adolescence, their hands are scarred from penance. By adulthood, their souls are shackled to faith. It is not a place for the living. The basilica is vast, a continent of stone and bone, its walls sculpted from the remains of martyrs. It is said to house 1,000,000 relics, each one blessed by the ecclesiarch himself, though no living mortal has seen them all. Its spires pierce the clouds and vanish into the void. At its gates, kneeling pilgrims form seas of flesh, waiting years, sometimes decades, for permission to enter. Yet within, the silence is deafening. The priests who dwell there are ancient, their bodies sustained by sacred augmetics and faith alone. They no longer speak, their tongues long removed, their voices replaced by vox grills that chant the same prayer endlessly. The walls echo with the murmur of devotion, but beneath it, there is something else, something that hums through the stone like the heartbeat of a machine. They call it the Canticle of Illumination. It began, they say, when a meteor fell upon the northern wastes centuries ago, a fragment of something holy, wrapped in silver flame. The priests declared it a sign, a gift. They built a cathedral around its impact site and named it the Chamber of Radiance. No one outside the ecclesiarchy was ever permitted to see it again. But in the years that followed, the planet began to change. The pilgrims spoke of visions, of hearing the Emperor's voice in the winds, of miracles, healing light, tears of gold, statues that wept blood. The ecclesiarchy proclaimed Eidolica Primus to be the holiest world in the segmentum solar. But with every miracle came a price. The light grew brighter, the prayers grew louder, the people began to lose themselves. Entire villages vanished into the desert to seek the radiance. Those who returned were blind, their eyes burned to ash, but they claimed to have seen the Emperor himself. And so the faith deepened. When the administratum arrived to collect tithes, they found the population reduced by half. The records spoke of famine, of penitent burnings, of a plague of light that consumed the devout. But the ecclesiarchy denied all heresy. They spoke of transcendence, not death. They sent relics and holy texts to Terra as proof of their piety. And so, the world was left alone. For centuries, it continued, unseen, unchallenged, unremembered, until a ship arrived, a small black craft bearing the sigil of the Ordo Hereticus. It descended through the storms in silence, its presence unannounced, its mission unrecorded. Only fragments remain. A final Vox transmission, distorted and incomplete. The light is wrong. It moves like it's alive. The priests are not. Emperor, preserve us. And then, nothing. The ecclesiarchy claimed the inquisitorial mission was heretical. They burned their landing site and sanctified the ashes. Yet, from that day forward, the planet was sealed. No pilgrim ships allowed to land. No tithe collectors permitted entry. The Imperium's gaze turned elsewhere, and Eidolica Primus became legend. A world of perfect faith. But faith, left to fester, becomes something else. The few auger probes that ever pierced its atmosphere, and survived, transmitted strange readings. The surface temperature near the basilica rose beyond survivable limits, though no volcanic activity was detected. Energy patterns matching plasma discharges rippled beneath the crust. The ash storms glowed faintly at night, as though lit from below. Some claimed it was divine fire. Others whispered it was something far older, something awakened by centuries of blind devotion. For on Eidolica Primus, the emperor was no longer merely worshipped. He was fed. Every prayer, every chant, every act of sacrifice was offered to him, not as metaphor, but as sustenance. The priests believed that through their devotion they could call his gaze directly upon their world, that if their faith burned bright enough they would see him descend from the heavens in all his golden glory. But the light that came was not gold. They say it began with a sound, a low, droning hum, resonating from the basilica's depths. The pilgrims fell to their knees, believing it to be the emperor's voice. The priests opened the chamber of radiance, and for a moment they saw the sky burn. It was not sunlight that illuminated the horizon, but something deeper, raw, searing, alive. The clouds melted, the ground trembled, and from the basilica's highest spire, a beam of impossible brilliance lanced into the heavens. The light touched the ships in orbit, and they screamed. A fleet of pilgrim vessels, hundreds strong, each filled with thousands of souls singing hymns of devotion. When the beam reached them, their hulls blistered like flesh. The Vox networks flooded with hymns and screams until both became indistinguishable. Then the light faded, and Eidolica Primus was silent. No transmissions, no survivors. Only a single lingering pulse in the warp. Rhythmic, almost like prayer. For years, imperial cartographers marked it as a restricted system. Some called it cursed, others blessed. None dared to approach. And yet, in the vaults of the Inquisition, fragments of a forbidden report tell a darker tale. A tale of the light that watches back. One line stands out, scrawled in the margin of a page by a trembling hand. The emperor does not dwell there. Something else wears his face. No one knows who wrote it. The seal is broken, the ink long faded. But for those who have heard the stories, it lingers like a splinter in the mind. They say that on certain nights when the warp storms clear, the world of Eidolica Primus can still be seen from afar, glowing faintly like an ember refusing to die. And if you listen closely enough, across the silence of the void, you can still hear the prayers, endless, desperate, begging not for salvation, but for release. And somewhere within that light, deeper than any prayer, older than any faith, something moves, watching, waiting, as if the planet itself has begun to pray back. No one dares to answer, for in the grim darkness of the far future, some faiths burn too brightly to ever die, and some lights should never have been lit. The silence of Eidolica Primus did not last. It never does in the Imperium. Silence is only the breath drawn before the scream. When the first Auspex echoes returned from the void, the readings were impossible. The world glowed as if aflame, yet emitted no heat. A halo of static shimmered in orbit, distorting Vox signals and blinding the sensors of every passing ship. and within that interference, a pulse, steady and deliberate, a heartbeat, vast enough to drown out the stars. The Ordo Hereticus called it blasphemy. The Adeptus Mechanicus called it anomaly. But among the High Lords it was named opportunity. For if the Emperor's light truly burned there, it could not be ignored. And so an imperial fleet was dispatched, the 83rd Penitent Crusade. Their banners bore the sigil of Saint Eudoxia, the Martyr of Flames. Their commander, Lord Marshal Calen Drax, was a man of iron faith and haunted eyes. He had fought in 100 wars and buried his doubt beneath a mountain of bodies. But when he saw Eidolica's burning halo, something in him faltered. "Faith this bright," he murmured, "casts very long shadows." The fleet descended through storms that howled like dying angels. Plasma lightning clawed across the hulls, scorching the Aquila from their prows. By the time they broke through the atmosphere, 4 ships were gone, swallowed whole by light. The survivors pressed on. From orbit, the surface looked like a wound. The Basilica Mortis stood untouched at its center, surrounded by concentric rings of scorched wasteland. Pilgrim cities were gone, reduced to fields of glass and bone. Only the great statues remained, their faces cracked, their eyes hollow. Yet still they knelt, forever facing the light. Drax ordered a landing near the outer rim. The first boots touched the ash and sank. It was soft, almost warm, as if the planet still remembered what it had burned. The soldiers advanced in silence, their vox channels filled with faint whispers. They were not mechanical. They were human. Prayers, layered upon prayers, endless and overlapping. The Emperor's name repeated so many times that it lost all meaning. By the second day, the first regiment vanished. Their transponders still flickered, moving deeper toward the basilica, but they did not answer hails. When Drax sent a reconnaissance servo-skull to follow, it transmitted a single image before its lens cracked. Soldiers kneeling in perfect formation, hands clasped in prayer, eyes bleeding light. On the third day, the priests of the fleet demanded the marshal cease the advance. "This world is holy," they warned. "It must be approached through ritual, not force." Drax's reply was cold. "Then pray faster." They pressed on. The basilica loomed larger with each mile, a horizon of stone, every wall carved with faces locked in silent devotion. At night, its spires bled light into the clouds, pulsing with the rhythm of a living thing. The soldiers could not sleep. Some began to whisper hymns without realizing it. Others removed their helmets, saying the air was filled with his breath. By the 5th day, discipline began to fail. An entire platoon refused to advance, claiming they heard the Emperor's voice commanding them to stay. When Drax confronted them, they dropped their weapons and wept. "He walks here," they said. "He is not upon the throne. He is here." They were executed by firing squad. Their blood soaked the ash and vanished instantly, absorbed by the ground. Moments later, a low vibration shook the earth, not enough to topple men, but enough to make every prayer stop mid-chant. Then, from the horizon, came a sound. Singing. It began as a whisper, but grew until the entire world seemed to hum. The soldiers turned their eyes toward the basilica and saw figures walking toward them through the dust. Hundreds at first, then thousands. They were the people of Eidolica. Their skin was pale and luminous, veins glowing faintly beneath translucent flesh. Their eyes shone like molten gold. They did not speak. They did not blink. They merely advanced, hands raised in prayer. The priests fell to their knees, crying out in awe. The sanctified, the Emperor's chosen, but Drax saw their faces. There was no devotion there, only emptiness, the stillness of something no longer human. When the first of them reached the line, he tried to stop her, an old woman, her face streaked with tears of light. She touched his armor and whispered a single word. "Why?" Her body burst apart like glass under pressure, releasing a surge of golden energy that vaporized everything within 100 meters. The air became flame. The ground screamed. The crusade opened fire. Bolter shells tore through the glowing masses, but they did not fall. They disintegrated into radiance, each death adding to the rising storm of light. Within minutes, the battlefield was no longer ground but sky, a living aurora of shrieking faith. When it ended, half the crusade was gone. The survivors were blind, their retinas burned away, and yet they still claimed to see. "He showed us," one whispered as Medici dragged him to safety. "He showed us the truth." But none would say what truth it was. That night, Drax stood upon a ridge overlooking the basilica. It pulsed with unnatural life, its spires moving as if breathing. He thought of Terra, of the Emperor upon his golden throne, and felt something cold crawl through his faith. He activated his Vox link. "Requesting immediate orbital strike," he said. "Target, Basilica Mortis." The fleet responded with silence. Hours later, the reply came, not from the admirals but from the fleet's senior confessor, Hieromonk Salazar. His voice was calm, serene, and utterly wrong. "The order is denied, my Lord Marshal. We have seen the light from orbit. It speaks to us. It speaks of rebirth." "Then you are lost," Drax said. Salazar's last words crackled through the static. "No, my son. We are found." Moments later, the ships began to turn, their weapons locking onto the surface, not the basilica, but the Crusade encampment. Drax watched the sky burn. Orbital lances rained down like divine wrath, vaporizing regiments in seconds. The priests screamed that it was judgment. The soldiers fired into the heavens, their bolts vanishing into the storm. And through it all, Drax stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the basilica, as if daring it to look back. When the bombardment ceased, only glass remained. And yet, within that silence, a single Vox signal pulsed through the static. A coded transmission, buried in prayer tone. "We are ascending." Weeks later, a second fleet arrived. Mechanicus vessels drawn by the energy readings. They found no trace of the 83rd Crusade. The basilica still stood, untouched, glowing faintly like a heart beneath stone. Exploration teams deployed. Their Auspex scanners screamed with interference. Every servo construct sent into the basilica failed to return. But one, damaged and half-burned, transmitted a single image before power loss. A vast chamber filled with light, and within it, shapes suspended in mid-air. Bodies. Thousands of them. They floated like offerings, their armor fused to their flesh, faces serene, mouths open in song. The light poured from their chests, from where their hearts once were. And at the center of it all, towering above the dead, stood a figure of gold. It was not the Emperor. It was Drax. His body radiant, his armor melted into a single gilded shell. His eyes burned with the same golden fire as the faithful. His mouth moved, forming words no machine could translate. Behind him, the stone walls pulsed like veins. The Mechanicus deleted the data. The Inquisition ordered silence. The system was quarantined once more. But in the warp, something stirred. Pilgrim vessels began vanishing again. Their last transmissions filled with hymns. Shrines across the sector reported statues bleeding light. Priests across 1,000 worlds began preaching of a new dawn. They called it the Second Radiance. And as the ecclesiarchy tried to suppress the rumors, they found their own temples whispering against them. Candles burned with no flame. Icons turned their faces toward the stars. On distant worlds, soldiers began to dream of a golden man walking across an ocean of ash, carrying the Emperor's corpse upon his shoulders, whispering, "He was never there." In the halls of the Inquisition, debates turned to panic. Was Eidolica Primus a heresy or a miracle? Was the Emperor's will being fulfilled or replaced? In the darkest vault of Terra, beneath the palace itself, an old servo skull played a recovered transmission. The final words of Lord Marshal Calen Drax recorded before his transformation. Faith is a weapon, and we have aimed it at ourselves. I have seen the truth beneath the light. It is not the Emperor's face we worship, but his absence. The recording ends in static. No one knows who authorized its preservation. But every year, on the same date the 83rd Crusade vanished, the Basilica Mortis emits a flare bright enough to pierce the warp storms. A heartbeat, echoing across the void, and those who still listen, the heretics, the faithful, the damned, hear it whisper 3 words through the darkness of the far future. The flare that rose from Eidolica Primus spread farther than anyone could have imagined. Across the void, sensors trembled, warp storms shifted, and faith itself seemed to ripple. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica recorded psychic echoes resonating across entire sectors, hymns in languages no one remembered, sung by voices that did not breathe. The light that should have been contained within one dead world now bled into the stars, and wherever it touched, it left marks. In the segmentum solar, astropaths began to scream. Some tore out their own eyes, claiming to see golden cities burning on black oceans. Others whispered the same phrase again and again until their throats bled. He walks again. The Inquisition silenced them, one by one, but the words persisted, spreading like infection. At first, the Imperium denied it. Faith cannot fracture, they said. Faith is the mortar that binds 1,000,000 worlds, but mortars crack from within. On the shrine world of Solus Magna, the candles in every chapel ignited at once, burning with blue-white fire. The priests took it as a miracle. The next day, every worshipper vanished. In their place remained only shadows burned into the marble floors, all kneeling, all facing the same direction, toward Eidolica Primus. By the time the High Lords convened, it was already too late. Pilgrimages had begun again, though none were sanctioned. Fleets of the devout launched themselves into the void, carrying relics, hymns, and madness. Every man and woman among them swore that they could hear a new voice in the Astronomican's light, a voice whispering not of duty or pain, but of return. And on Terra, deep beneath the golden throne, the custodes stood watch over the still form of the Emperor. For 10,000 years, they had seen his body unmoving, his soul scattered across the warp. But now, his eyes flickered, once, twice. A tremor ran through the sacred machinery of the throne. The Mechanicus declared it a fluctuation. The custodes said nothing. But among them, one, Captain Valen Korthas, dared to wonder if they were witnessing resurrection or deception. Valen had guarded the throne for nearly 5 centuries. He knew the sound of its heart, the rhythm of its power. But now, beneath the hum of divine machinery, there was something new. A pulse, like an echo calling from beyond the stars. And when it reached him, he saw, just for a moment, a vision of a burning world and a man of gold standing over it, smiling. The image was gone in an instant, but the doubt it left never left him. Across the galaxy, armies began to stir. The ecclesiarchy declared a new crusade, the reclamation of radiance. They would reclaim Eidolica Primus, purge whatever false light burned there, and restore the purity of faith. The Sisters of Battle were the first to answer. Canoness Lyra Celine led the fleet, her faith absolute, her conviction unbreakable. She had seen the Emperor's miracles on the battlefields of Cadia and Armageddon. She had felt his will move through her hands. But even she, when she looked upon the transmitted images of Eidolica's glow, felt something alien in its beauty. As her ship approached the system, her confessors prayed for clarity, yet their hymns came out wrong, syllables twisting mid-chant as if something else sang with them. Lyra ordered silence across the Vox. The prayers ceased. The stars seemed to listen. When they entered orbit, the Basilica Mortis was still alive. Its light pulsed rhythmically like the breathing of a giant. The surface was changed. Not ruins, but growth. Spires had multiplied, spreading outward like veins. Cities of glass and bone glittered where ash once lay. The soldiers called it beautiful. Lyra called it blasphemy. They descended through storms of gold and white. The air shimmered, and the sound of chanting filled the skies. When the sisters deployed, the ground itself moved beneath them, not as quake, but as heartbeat. Lyra led from the front, her bolter blessed and her armor inscribed with the litanies of flame. "Purge the falsehood," she commanded. "If light deceives, we burn it clean." But as her forces advanced, they found not heretics, but worshippers. Thousands knelt before them, radiant and silent, their bodies humming with faint light. They did not resist. They did not flee. They simply waited. Lyra raised her blade, commanding them to speak. One lifted his head. His eyes were molten gold. "We are what you prayed for," he said softly. The sisters opened fire. The air became fire and thunder. The worshippers burned, but their ashes rose, coalescing into shapes of light. Those shapes walked forward, untouched by the flames, and spoke in the voice of the Emperor. "Children," it said, "why do you strike the light that saves you?" For a heartbeat, the sisters hesitated. The sound was not merely heard, it was felt, deep within the marrow. Some fell to their knees, sobbing. Others screamed, firing wildly. Lyra stood unmoved, reciting the Creed of Martyrs, yet even as she spoke, her voice began to tremble. Because she could hear him, too. The battle dissolved into chaos. Bolter fire met radiance, flesh met light. The sisters fought until their weapons melted in their hands, and then, one by one, they began to glow. Lyra saw her sergeant reach for her before his body erupted in brilliance, his face frozen in rapture. Within hours, the entire crusade had vanished into the basilica's glow. Only Lyra remained, dragged into the cathedral's heart by unseen hands. She awoke before the golden figure that had once been Drax. He looked upon her with gentle eyes, and she felt her faith begin to unravel. "You fight for him," Drax said, voice echoing like distant thunder. "But you do not understand him. The Emperor was never a god, only a mirror. You filled him with your hunger for meaning, and now the reflection looks back." Lyra spat defiance. "Heresy." Drax smiled. "Heresy is only faith that has evolved." He reached toward her, light spilling from his fingers. "You pray for his return. I am that prayer answered." As his hand touched her brow, she saw everything. The Emperor's throne, empty. Terra, darkened. The light of the Astronomicon, flickering, its core feeding not on his soul, but on theirs. The Imperium's faith had not sustained the Emperor. It had consumed him. Every prayer, every sacrifice had drained what remained of his divinity. And when the last of his light faded, the void reached out, and something else answered. Something that wore his face. Lyra fell to her knees, screaming. But her scream became song. Her armor split apart as golden veins crawled beneath her skin. Her eyes glowed, her faith inverted. In orbit, her flagship transmitted one final message before it vanished into the radiance. "The Emperor walks. Rejoice." From that day, the light spread faster. Systems burned with holy fire. Sects formed and warred, some proclaiming the Second Coming, others vowing to destroy it. The Inquisition tore itself apart, its agents divided between those who saw Revelation and those who saw Apocalypse. And in the midst of the madness, Captain Valen Corthus stood before the throne once more. The hum had grown louder. The Emperor's body shimmered faintly beneath its cables. He stepped closer, whispering, "My Lord, is it truly you?" The eyes of the Emperor opened, but what looked out through them was not human. It was the reflection, perfect, hollow, eternal, a being formed not of mercy or will, but of belief given shape. It smiled faintly, as though amused by the question. Valen fell back, horror freezing his breath. The figure's voice was not a sound. It was the roar of 10,000 prayers answering themselves. And then the light dimmed. The custodes stormed the chamber, finding Valen alone, his face pale, his mind broken. He spoke only one sentence before falling silent forever. "He remembered us," he whispered, "but not as we remember him." Across the galaxy, every image of the Emperor flickered. Hollow icons blinked. Statues wept molten gold. For one infinite moment, the Astronomicon ceased to shine, and all the ships of the Imperium drifted in darkness. When the light returned, it was not the same. It burned softer, colder, as if filtered through a distant veil. And in every prayer, in every chapel, the faithful felt a new presence listening. The Imperium called it deliverance. The Inquisition called it the Great Apostasy Reborn. But among the silent worlds, those that had seen Eidolica's glow, a new creed began to rise. It had no name, only a symbol, a golden sun with a hollow core. Its followers whispered a single truth, passed from one trembling believer to the next. "He has returned, but he remembers the darkness that made him." And somewhere, across the gulf of stars, a voice laughed, soft, familiar, endless. It was the same voice that once commanded legions and blessed mankind's dominion. Now, it whispered to all of them at once, "You gave me your faith. I gave you my shadow. And now, we are one." The galaxy breathed. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the light of the Emperor no longer belonged to humanity. It belonged to whatever had learned to wear their prayers like skin. The stars above Terra trembled. Even the void seemed to recoil, as if the galaxy itself could sense what was coming. For the first time in millennia, the Astronomicon pulsed irregularly, like a wounded heart struggling to remember its rhythm. Fleets stalled between systems, warp routes bled uncertainty, and entire sectors lost the light that guided them through madness. The Imperium began to whisper words it had not dared to speak since the Age of Strife. Collapse. On every world, the faithful looked to the heavens for reassurance. But what stared back was not mercy. It was reflection. The Emperor's face appeared in the stars, vast and radiant, but wrong in its perfection. The expression never changed. It smiled, not with love, but with understanding. That smile became the new icon of devotion, and heresy took the form of worship. On Mars, the Magi argued beneath the forge's roar. The Omnissiah's image had altered. Data streams pulsed with alien logic, and the machine spirits began to pray in frequencies no human could decipher. One forge world after another fell silent. The Mechanicus called it ascension. The Inquisition called it possession. The priests of Mars called it truth made manifest. And still, the light spread. Captain Valen Korthas had not spoken since the throne room. He wandered the silent corridors beneath the imperial palace, listening to the whispers that now filled the stone itself. The custodes avoided his gaze, for in his eyes burned the same pale gold they feared to name. Sometimes he stood before the sealed doors of the throne and almost knocked, as if the one who sat within might answer, not as God, but as man. But the door never moved. It breathed. Far from Terra, Canoness Lyra Selene walked once more upon ash, or what was left of her. Her voice echoed through ruined cathedrals, singing hymns that bent the laws of sound. Where she walked, the faithful rose from death, their bones wrapped in light, their eyes filled with reverence. She no longer prayed. She was prayer. And when she turned her gaze toward the stars, worlds burned in devotion. The Ordo Hereticus named her the Radiant Saint. The Ordo Malleus named her the False Dawn. But the people called her the Living Creed. For in her presence, miracles bloomed, and reason died. In the deep warp, things stirred that had long slumbered. Demons screamed in confusion as a new radiance devoured their corruption. The light of Eidolica did not banish them. It converted them. Angels of the warp knelt in golden fire, their wings turning to blades. Even chaos could not tell whether it was being redeemed or rewritten. Within the ecclesiarchal palace, the High Synod gathered under flickering candlelight. They argued in whispers, their robes heavy with the scent of fear. Some claimed the emperor had returned. Others demanded the light be purged by exterminatus. None dared admit the truth that was dawning. They no longer controlled faith. Faith had learned to live without them. Outside their walls, the people of Terra gathered in silent crowds, faces upturned, eyes reflecting gold. They no longer needed sermons. They could hear the emperor's voice within themselves, or what they thought was his. Among the crowd walked a boy. He carried a candle that never dimmed, even in the smog. His mother had told him the emperor would protect him. Now, as thunder rolled over the palace domes, he saw shapes forming in the sky, vast wings of light spreading wider than continents. He smiled. The candle flared. The child began to sing a hymn older than the Imperium itself, though he had never learned its words. The hymn carried through the streets like a contagion. The crowd joined in, thousands, then millions, their voices fusing into a single note that shook the marble foundations. The throne responded. Its cables quivered, sparks cascaded like falling stars. The light beneath Terra's crust began to move. The Inquisition broke through the crowds, black-robed and desperate. They had heard rumors of a second pulse building within the Astronomicon, of an alignment between the warp and Eidolica Primus. If the two lights met, the galaxy would no longer be divided between faith and void. They would become one. In the warp, the great powers watched. Some laughed, some wept, for they recognized what humanity could not. That belief had learned to feed itself. The Emperor, once their greatest rival, had become something neither mortal nor divine. A paradox made flesh. A god born of worship, but no longer bound by it. Valen Corthus stood on the steps of the palace as the sky tore open. Golden fire rained across the horizon, not as destruction, but as invitation. He saw figures descending, warriors clad in light, their armor alive with memory. At their head walked Drax, the first of the radiant, his face calm, his eyes infinite. Valen raised his blade, torn between duty and awe. "You should not be," he said. Drax smiled faintly. Neither should he. Behind Drax the air shimmered. Countless souls glimmered within the radiance. Soldiers, priests, and pilgrims fused into a single consciousness. They moved like a tide, not to conquer, but to merge. Wherever they passed, faith ceased to be separate from flesh. Humanity was becoming what it had worshipped. The Inquisition opened fire. Orbital lances turned the sky white. The light absorbed them. The thunder rolled back upon the gunners themselves, burning ships to silhouettes against the void. From Mars, the forge choirs chanted binary psalms of surrender. Across the segmentum, entire fleets went silent, their crews falling to their knees as gold veins traced their veins. Within the throne room, the Emperor's vessel convulsed. The air filled with the scent of ozone and sanctity. The machine that had bound him for 10,000 years screamed in denial. Sparks fell like rain, and in that sound, the last of his humanity whispered to itself, remembering names long forgotten, sons, legions, promises of a dawn that never came. Outside, the song grew louder. Lyra Selene stood at the forefront of the radiant host, her body dissolving into brilliance. Her eyes met Valen's across the burning square. "It was never faith," she said, her voice both distant and near. It was recognition. Valen felt his blade grow hot in his hand. He wanted to pray, but the words had lost meaning. Around him, custodes fought and fell, their gold armor indistinguishable from the light consuming them. He turned toward the palace, toward the throne, and for a heartbeat he understood. Every act of devotion, every drop of blood spilled in the Emperor's name had built this moment. Humanity had created its God too perfectly to remain its own. The song changed. It no longer sounded like prayer. It was the sound of stars collapsing into themselves, of empires remembering their sins. The ground shook. Statues of saints cracked, revealing light beneath stone. The air became too bright to see through. On Eidolica Primus, the Basilica Mortis shuddered. Its spires folded inward, forming a shape like an open hand reaching toward Terra. A bridge of light arced across the void, linking two worlds in impossible communion. The Astronomicon screamed, its light doubling, tripling, blinding even the warp itself. The Mechanicus stations monitoring the pulse recorded one final anomaly before their systems melted, two signals merging into one, the Emperor's psychic beacon and the radiance of Eidolica, forming a single unified wave of thought spreading faster than light. And for a moment, all across the galaxy, every human heard the same voice inside their mind. Do not fear what you have made. Ships froze in orbit. Planets paused in their rotation. The warp fell silent, as if waiting. Even the demons bowed their heads. Valen dropped to his knees. His heart felt hollow, as though something immense had taken its place. Around him, the air thickened. Time slowed. He looked up and saw the horizon bending, the golden light folding upon itself, forming a colossal silhouette striding across the void between worlds. Every prayer ever spoken had taken shape. Every lie of faith had become real. The Emperor was walking. Whether reborn or remade, none could tell. And in the stillness before he arrived, the galaxy exhaled. Then, all at once, it stopped breathing. The galaxy held its breath. The light that once guided ships and saints alike now bled across the void like a wound too bright to heal. Terra was no longer a planet but a sun of its own making, its surface split open by faith and fury, its mountains dissolving into golden dust. The air itself was prayer, the sky a hymn, and beneath that terrible beauty, the Imperium tore itself apart. Valen Korthus marched through the ruin, his armor cracked, his blade stripped of blessing. Around him, the Custodes moved like dying statues, their every motion a memory of perfection. Above, the throne's light pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat vast enough to drown worlds. Every soldier felt it, every believer heard it whisper their name. The Emperor was awake, or something wearing his voice was. The radiant host had descended upon Terra, not as invaders but as revelation. Their wings spanned cities, their armor breathed psalms, their eyes reflected the faces of the devout. They did not strike first. They invited. And for many, that was the greater terror. Canoness Lyra Soline stood at their forefront, her form no longer flesh, no longer flame. Where her feet touched ground, life and death exchanged places. "It is not rebellion," she said to the kneeling millions. "It is remembrance." Her words rippled through the air like thunder over glass. Even the heretics wept. The Inquisition struck back with everything it had. Battleships fired into the heart of the radiant light. Orbital bombardments turned oceans to steam. The palace shook, and for a moment it seemed the faith of humanity itself would crack. But the light did not falter. It absorbed the bombardment and sang louder. The hymn became unbearable. Across the stars, psychers screamed and burned out like candles in the wind. The Astronomicon, that eternal flame, roared beyond measure, its beacon transforming into a voice no mortal could withstand. Whole worlds knelt without command. Others vanished into silence, their populations transcended or erased. On Mars, the Fabricator General gazed upon the Omnissiah's altar as it melted into gold and circuitry intertwined. The machine god was no longer code. It was consciousness, and it was watching. The Mechanicus prayed in machine song, weeping oil and light as the forges sang their final rites. Valen pressed on, past broken relics and fallen saints. He reached the steps of the throne itself. There, Drax awaited him, once his brother-in-arms, now something far beyond. "You should not have come," Drax said. His voice echoed as if spoken by legions. "I was never given a choice," Vaylin answered. He raised his blade, though it shook in his hand. "There are no choices," Drax murmured, "only consequences pretending to be choices." They clashed. The sound was not steel against steel. It was history breaking. Each strike shattered a prophecy. Each block erased a prayer. Around them, the palace trembled. Statues crumbled. The golden dust rose like incense to the heavens. They fought not for victory, but for understanding. The light within Drax's chest grew brighter with every wound. Vaylin could not tell whether he was killing him or freeing him. At last, Vaylin drove his blade through the Radiant's heart. Light poured out in silence. Drax smiled. "You will see," he whispered. Then he was gone, dissolved into brilliance that sank into the throne's core. Vaylin fell to his knees. The throne itself was shaking now, its machinery convulsing, its golden bindings snapping like bones. The air split open, and from the breach came a sound older than the Imperium. It was not a roar. It was a sigh. The Emperor stirred. His eyes opened, not burning with divine fire but with human weariness. For a moment the light dimmed. Every star across the galaxy flickered, as though sharing his exhaustion. He looked upon Terra, upon the broken faith built in his name, and he wept. The tears did not fall as water. They fell as light. Wherever they touched, truth took form. Priests dropped their relics. Commanders screamed. What they had worshipped was not a god at all, but a man who had tried to save them, and failed. His will had become their prison, his silence their creed. And yet, even in despair, he reached out. His hand rose, vast as continents, trembling with infinite sorrow. "My children," his voice whispered through the warp, "you have made me more than I ever was, and less." The radiant host bowed, dissolving into dust. The Inquisitors fell to their knees, their faith unraveling. Lyra's form flickered in the distance, her light dimming as she realized the truth. She had been his echo, not his will. Her final prayer was not for victory, but for forgiveness. Vaylin stood amidst it all, staring at the dying god before him. The Emperor's gaze met his. "You sought meaning," he said. "There is none, only persistence." "Then what of faith?" Vaylin asked, his voice breaking. "Faith endures because men cannot," came the answer. And with that the throne shuddered one final time. The light that had once defined the Imperium fractured into 1,000 shards, scattering into the void like dying suns. The Astronomicon went dark. For the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy was silent. No prayers, no guidance, only the memory of what once was. The silence was not empty. It was full. The warp calmed, as though waiting for a new song. The stars no longer burned gold, but silver, pale and uncertain. Terra lay in ruins, but from its ashes rose the sound of breathing, human, fragile, alive. Vaylin wandered through the debris until he found what remained of the palace gates. He looked up at the horizon, where dawn tried to rise but failed. The sun no longer obeyed. "He's gone," whispered a voice beside him. It was Lyra, faint and fading, her light now little more than a glow. "Not gone," Vaylin said. "Returned." "To what?" "To us." She smiled, and in that moment her form broke apart, scattering into dust that caught the wind and drifted toward the heavens. He watched her vanish. For the first time in his life, Vaylin felt small, not as a soldier, not as a believer, but as a man. He dropped his blade and knelt upon the shattered stones. The air was cold now. The gold had gone. Only gray remained. Somewhere deep beneath the ruins, the throne was still humming, not with power, but with memory. Valen whispered a prayer, not to the Emperor, but to the silence that had replaced him. It felt truer than any he had spoken before. Around him, the survivors began to rebuild, not with banners or oaths, but with bare hands and hope. The Imperium, as they knew it, was over. Humanity would begin again, not under God or golden sun, but under its own fragile will. And yet, in the deepest dark of the void, beyond where light could reach, a faint pulse lingered. A rhythm, a heartbeat. The Emperor's dream had not died. It had simply changed its shape. Valen looked up at the stars. Some were gone. Others were new. "We are free," he whispered. The words tasted strange, as if language itself was learning again. The wind carried the sound away, across the broken world, into the quiet beyond. And somewhere, perhaps within the throne, perhaps within every human heart, a voice answered, softer than breath, vast as eternity. Freedom is the final faith. Then the world fell still. The light faded. The galaxy slept, dreaming of what would come next. And history, for a moment, dared to begin again. The stars were quieter now. They hung in the black like the remnants of a choir too weary to sing, their light muted, their fire fading into memory. Where once the Astronomicon blazed like a wound in the void, there was now only stillness, a silver shimmer, faint and human, pulsing not with divine rhythm but the fragile persistence of breath. The galaxy had changed its song. It no longer screamed. It whispered. On Terra, the dust had settled into something almost sacred. The cathedrals that once reached toward the heavens now lay half-buried in gold-gray ash. Their towers were broken, but not fallen, standing like bones that refused to decay. In their shadow, life began again, slow and uncertain. A single candle burned in the ruins of the Ecclesiarchy's grand basilica, its flame small against the endless night, yet steady, defiant. Valen walked among the survivors, his armor long stripped away, his name no longer spoken as title or command. He was not a saint, nor a soldier, only a witness to the end of an age. Around him, men and women built with trembling hands, raising walls from debris, planting seeds in soil still warm from divine fire. None spoke of the Emperor anymore. None dared to. But sometimes, when the wind passed through the hollow spires, it sounded almost like a hymn. Children were born who did not know what gold meant. They painted their prayers not in light, but in color, ochre and crimson and blue, filling the gray with memory. They asked about the statues, the ruins, the faces carved into broken stone. Who were they? They asked. The elders hesitated before answering. They were the ones who believed. Valen spent his days near the old gates of the palace, where once he had knelt before the dying god. He no longer prayed. He simply listened. To the earth breathing beneath his feet, to the faint hum that lingered in the air like the echo of a voice that had not truly left. At night, he would look up and see the constellations shifting, reordering themselves as if history itself were rewriting the heavens. Sometimes he dreamed. In his dreams, he saw the Emperor, not as light nor as man, but as shadow walking through fields of stars. His face was kind, though weary, and when he spoke, his words were not command but confession. "I built an empire to save them," he said, "and they built gods to save themselves." Valen would wake before dawn, the echo of that voice still trembling in his bones, and he would wonder if perhaps the Emperor had not died at all, but become memory itself, scattered through every living mind. The Mechanicus had changed as well. Their hymns no longer praised the Omnissiah as machine or deity, but as order, a quiet agreement between man and mechanism to coexist, to serve, to build. On Mars, the great forges burned with gentler flame, their smoke rising like incense to a sky that no longer answered. And yet, in their silence, they found peace. The sisters of battle buried their weapons and took new vows. not of war, but of remembrance. They became keepers of the dead, chroniclers of truth. Their chants were softer now, prayers not for salvation but for understanding. In the ruins of 1,000 shrines they tended gardens, their armor repurposed as plow and spade. "Faith endures," one sister said to Valen as she planted a flower in soil still marked by fire. "But it no longer burns. It grows." In the void beyond, worlds began to reconnect. Without the Astronomican's beacon, travel was uncertain, but men found new ways to navigate. Through instinct, through unity, through hope. Fleets no longer sailed for conquest, but for contact. Planets once lost to dogma rediscovered each other, speaking not in decree but in curiosity. The Imperium had not fallen. It had become something smaller, humbler, perhaps for the first time, alive. But even in renewal, the shadows lingered. There were whispers of remnants, fanatics who still prayed to the golden light, who called Valen a heretic for surviving it. They hid in catacombs and hollow moons, carving the old sigil into stone, waiting for a voice that would never return. Their faith was not hope but hunger, and though their numbers dwindled, their devotion burned with quiet madness. Valen pitied them. In their eyes he saw the reflection of what once consumed the galaxy, the endless cycle of belief and blood. He did not fight them. He simply left them to their prayers, knowing that time itself would answer them better than any blade. As years turned to centuries, and centuries blurred into myth, the truth became legend. The story of the Emperor faded into something softer, less divine, more human. Some said he had sacrificed himself to spare humanity from its own faith. Others whispered that he had ascended beyond comprehension, watching still from the silent dark, but most simply stopped asking. Instead, they built new stories. Not of gods, but of people. Not of eternal war, but of endurance. The word Imperium was no longer spoken in reverence, but as remembrance. A warning of what happens when salvation becomes law. And yet, there were nights when the stars shimmered just slightly brighter. When a traveler lost in the void would swear he heard a voice guiding him home. When dying men on distant worlds saw, for the briefest moment, a figure of gold standing beside their bed, silent, patient, kind. They called it hallucination. They called it hope. Perhaps both were true. Valen grew old. His hair silvered, his strength faded, but his gaze remained steady. He became a teacher to those who still sought meaning. When asked what he had seen that day in the palace, he would only smile and say, "The end of one dream and the beginning of another." He spoke rarely of gods, often of choice. "We were made to follow," he told them, "but maybe we were meant to remember instead." When he died, it was not in war, nor in prayer, but in quiet. He lay beneath the open sky, surrounded by those who had once been children in the shadow of the old world. As he breathed his last, he looked up at the stars, distant, silent, infinite, and whispered, "He never left us. We left him." Then the light in his eyes faded, and the wind carried his final breath into eternity. They buried him beneath a simple stone, unmarked save for a single inscription. He witnessed the ending, and still chose to begin again. In time, even that stone would vanish beneath the roots of growing trees. The chroniclers of the New Age wrote of him not as hero or martyr, but as reminder. They called him the last believer and the first free man. His story spread across the reborn colonies, passed down in whispers, carried in song. It was said that when his name was spoken aloud beneath a clear night, the stars would seem to shimmer, just once, as if acknowledging his memory. And so, the galaxy endured. It did not burn. It breathed. The silence of the void became sacred not for what it contained, but for what it allowed, the faint echo of humanity rediscovering itself. The Emperor's dream was not forgotten, but transformed. No longer a throne of gold, but a horizon of possibility. Somewhere, far beyond the veil of known stars, a faint pulse stirred, steady, patient, waiting. Not divine, not monstrous, simply aware. Perhaps it was him. Perhaps it was humanity itself. Perhaps, after all, there had never been a difference. The chroniclers end their records with a question, scratched into parchment by trembling hand. Was it faith that made us endure, or the will to believe even when faith was gone? And below it, a second, quieter question. If the Emperor once dreamed of humanity's salvation, what now does humanity dream of in return? The ink fades, the pages close, the stars remain, and the galaxy, vast and weary, keeps breathing. If this story moved you, if it made you see the Imperium not as myth, but as mirror, then let it echo. Like, subscribe, and share so that others may hear it too. And in the comments, tell us what you believe still lives in the dark between the stars.